You know, there is great fear in our world this day because there is great evil in our world in our day. All you need to do is watch the news, read a headline. You will see many reasons to be afraid. There have been horrific events as of late where many people have been injured and killed, innocent victims of the evil that exists in our world. And in times where we see so many acts of evil and violence, people can start to wonder, where is God? How can these things happen in our world? Well, in times like this, well, in all days, it is good to remember that God is on His throne and He is in control, no matter what we see in the world around us. This reality can bring us comfort even when things appear to be in chaos. We have nothing to fear as believers because as believers, we belong to the one who is ultimately in control of all things. We have nothing to fear because though evil may run rampant, and it does, evil can never take away our relationship with the Lord. Though men may harm our bodies, they cannot touch our souls. And so we have nothing to fear because the reality is God is in control. This morning we're going to be reminded that no matter what circumstance we have in our life, God is at work to accomplish His perfect plan at all times. And knowing that, understanding that biblical truth can bring us great comfort, especially in days like we are experiencing in our nation currently. The reality is, evil people have perpetrated evil acts against others all through history. They've done it in the past, they're doing it in our day, and they will continue to do it in the future. But God is still in control, even in the midst of horrific events. He is ever near us. His love and care is ever upon us, especially in times of difficulty. Turn with me, please, to Genesis chapter 37. We'll be picking up where we left off last week in verse 12. We are studying the life of Joseph, and we were introduced to him last week. Recall, Joseph was one of the 12 sons of Jacob. We saw that, unfortunately, Jacob played favorites, and Joseph was his favorite. He had been given a very special, very colored tunic, and we saw last week that his brothers hated him. Joseph had received a special revelation from the Lord in a dream, promising that he would one day rule over the entire family. He had shared God's word to his brothers, and we saw their response was hatred towards him for it. And in our passage this morning, we will see what happened next to Joseph. And we're going to see three different situations that remind us of the reality that God is at work in any and every circumstance in our day-to-day lives. And it's important that we remember this simple truth. God is always at work in this world, and He is always on His throne. As we begin, we see that God is at work even in the humdrum events of our day-to-day lives. God is at work even in the most mundane of circumstances. Look as we pick up in verse 12 of Genesis chapter 37. Then his brothers went to pasture their flock in Shechem. Israel said to Joseph, "Are not your brothers pasturing the flock in Shechem? Come, and I will send you to them." And he said to him, "I will go." And he said to him, "Go now and see about the welfare of your brothers and the welfare of the flock, and bring word back to me." So he sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. As this section begins, Joseph and Jacob are going about their normal, everyday business. They're caring for their flocks. And in the midst of all of this, we will see that God was sovereignly directing and working, even though they aren't necessarily aware of His hand. The reality is God often works like that. His intervention often goes unnoticed by the majority. But we're reminded as we read this passage that even in the mundane, the humdrum, the normal events of life, God is at work. Now, Jacob and his family were living near the area of Hebron. That's located in the southern part of what at this time was Canaan, what would become the land of Israel. Shechem was about 60 miles to the north. And oftentimes, shepherds would have to take their flocks miles from home in search of good pasture. So it was not out of the ordinary for the sons of Jacob to take their flocks, which would be about a 5-day journey to the north in search of good pastures. But what is surprising as we study through Genesis is that they went near the city of Shechem, because Shechem was a town that this family had a rather checkered relationship with in the past. Earlier in Genesis, we read of an event that took place a few years before this, where Simeon and Levi had massacred the entire male population of the city of Shechem in retaliation for what one individual did to their sister. At that time, Jacob was concerned that the Canaanites might take their retaliation against the family for the actions of his sons, and so he moved his family far from Shechem. So it's surprising he would allow his sons to go back to that specific area. Perhaps it's because his sons were near Shechem that he became extra concerned that they had been gone for such a long time. Perhaps that's why he sent Joseph with such urgency on a journey to find out how his sons were doing, because he knew that his sons were taking the flocks into a dangerous area. So Jacob sent Joseph, his son, to go check out his sons and come back with a report. Remember earlier in chapter 37, we saw how Joseph had proven his faithfulness. He had reported back to his father faithfully about the misconduct of his brothers. So clearly Jacob trusted him completely, and he sent him on another mission to go check out on his brothers, and Joseph obeys. I think it's important that we remember how much his brothers hated him, and Joseph was fully aware of that. Remember, we're told last time that his brothers wouldn't even speak to him in a friendly manner. And so when Jacob sends Joseph to check on them, to report on what they're doing, Joseph knows he's going to a most hostile environment. He's going to check up on his brothers who don't like him in the first place and who certainly didn't like the last report that he shared with his father. And yet Joseph was a man who faithfully obeyed his father without hesitation. A reminder to us that a faithful man obeys those who are in authority. And so Joseph sent out despite any personal reservations he might have had. And what we see is that these are men just going about their normal everyday business. There's nothing unique about the story so far. Brothers are out shepherding the flocks. Father's concerned, sends out Joseph to find out how they're doing. But in the midst of this ordinary events of day-to-day living, God was at work. Look at what we see starting in verse 15. A man found him, and behold, he was wandering in the field. And the man asked him, "What are you looking for?" And he said, "I am looking for my brothers. Please tell me, where are they pasturing the flock?" And the man said, "They have moved from here. I heard them say, 'Let us go to Dothan.'" And so Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. Now, Joseph traveled to the area of Shechem only to find out that his brothers were nowhere around. And so he wandered about looking for clues where they might have gone. There's no cell phones, there's no postal service. He's out in the middle of nowhere wondering where his brothers could have gone in all the land with their flock. And it just so happens that he encounters a stranger out here in the middle of nowhere who just happened to overhear that his brothers had planned to head to Dothan. And so Joseph changes direction and he goes to Dothan, which would be about a 2 days journey from where he was. Now, on the surface, this chance encounter might seem like just a lucky set of circumstances. But we know that it was not luck. Joseph came to just the right man at just the right time, and that's because it was divine providence. A reminder to us that God is at work in the midst of our normal humdrum daily activities. He is directing our path to ensure that we go where He wants us to go. The reality is there are no just chance meetings in life. There are no just random circumstances, just lucky happenstance. That person you just happen to meet who sends you in a certain direction or changes the course of your life, that's no accident. That delay at the stoplight that keeps you from going somewhere, that's no accident. God is at work in the midst of our daily activities, and He directs our paths. God was at work to ensure that this unnamed man just happened to overhear his brother's plans. And He was at work to ensure that this unnamed man just happened to cross Joseph's path in the middle of a field. He was at work to direct Joseph to the city of Dothan, 75 miles from home, to find his brothers. Now, what we'll see that what happens next to Joseph would be a rather horrible experience. But it's what the Lord would use in order to accomplish His perfect plan for the entire family. God would use what would happen next to move the family to Egypt, as He had foretold years before to their great-grandfather Abraham. Joseph would experience great hardship when he finally did find his brothers. But through it all, God was at work. See, God has never promised that our lives are going to be easy or free from trouble. I wish He promised that, but He doesn't promise that at all. But He has promised to always be with us. He has promised to never abandon us. And what He has promised, He will accomplish. None can ever thwart His plan. And we can take great comfort in this reality, because we can never mess up God's plan for our life. His plan will be accomplished no matter what we try to do or even despite what we fail to do. God directs us. And as we go about our daily business, He will direct us even as He did Joseph. The Lord ensured that Joseph ended up exactly where he was supposed to go, and we're going to see he ends up there at exactly the perfect time that God wanted him to be there. So let us never think that there are just chance encounters with others in our life, or that we were really lucky that these things played out this way to get something in our life. God is in control of all situations, and we need to give Him the credit and the glory in all things. And when you really understand this biblical truth, then we can begin to experience peace in every situation, knowing the reality that God is always on His throne and He is always in control. So continuing, we see a second principle here in Joseph's life. God is at work even when men act hatefully. We see the hateful, the evil acts of Joseph's brothers in the rest of this chapter. And the narrative focuses in on their plans to destroy Joseph, their attempts to thwart God's plan of putting Joseph in authority over them one day. And we are reminded that God is always at work, even when men are hateful and vengeful and evil towards others. No matter the evil that men may do, God's plans will be accomplished in this world. He is at work even when horrible, evil men do violent acts towards others. Look what we see starting in verse 18. When they saw him from a distance, and before he came close to them, they plotted against him to put him to death. They said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Now then, let us come and let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. And we will say, a wild beast devoured him. Then let us see what will become of his dreams." Now, up to this point, we've been told very clearly how much his brothers hate him. But now their hatred goes to a whole new level. They mistreated Joseph. They mocked him. They made fun of him. They wouldn't talk to him. But now that hatred that had been growing for years in their hearts explodes into a full-blown plot for murder. This was more than just evil and hatred towards their brother, as horrible as that was. This was an act of rebellion against God. They were trying to change God's revealed plan. God had told them very clearly through the dream that Joseph was to be the leader, and they didn't want that, and so they were going to do something to change God's plan. So they saw Joseph coming from a distance. The landscape is very open there. Joseph had a brightly colored tunic. He probably stood out from a distance. They were far from their father's eyes, over 75 miles from home. And so one of the brothers says, "Hey, you know what? Let's just kill Joseph. Let's get rid of him once for all." They say, "Here comes this dreamer." The Hebrew phrase literally means, "Here comes the master of dreams." It's an expression that refers to one who was given prophetic dreams from God. Clearly, they said it with disdain and with contempt in their voices. Here comes the master of dreams, the one who gets special dreams from God. Let's kill him. Then what will become of his dreams? Let's see God do what He promised once Joseph is dead. Their hatred was not just against their brother, as horrible as that was. They were against the one who gave the dreams. They were angry and upset with God Himself. They were seeking to stop God's plan, and the only way they thought they could was if they killed Joseph. And if they killed Joseph, clearly that would have to change God's plan. If he was dead, they would never have to bow before him. Or so they thought. It's foolishness to think that we can ever thwart God's plan. God's plan cannot be stopped, not even by our sinful and evil deeds. We notice here the brothers even thought up a way to cover up their murder. They would blame his death on a wild beast. That would be believable. There were lots of wild beasts around. Joseph was out wandering by himself. It'd be easy for him to be picked off. So they make their plans. They're going to murder their brother when he arrives. But that's when Reuben speaks up. Look what we see in verse 21. Reuben heard this and rescued him out of their hands and said, "Let us not take his life." Reuben further said to them, "Shed no blood. Throw him into this pit, that is in the wilderness. But do not lay hands on him," so that he might rescue him out of their hands to restore him to his father. And Reuben was the firstborn. He was the eldest brother, and so his opinion carried a lot of weight. Now, we know that Reuben was no angel. In fact, we're told of his sinful deeds earlier in the book of Genesis. And while he had his character flaws, apparently he didn't want to go as far as to murder his own brother. But at the same time, he didn't want his brothers to turn on him and throw him in a pit and murder him as well. So he tries the political move. He tries to strike a compromise with his evil brothers. He tries manipulation and deceit instead of simply standing for the truth. He plays along with evil. He acts like he's on their side to try to do evil to his brother, but his real intent was to rescue his brother at some point when they were away. But we will see that his political manipulation, his partnering with evil and trying to get a compromise doesn't turn out like he thought it would. Well, what we see here is that God was at work even in the words that Reuben spoke to his brothers. The Lord used Reuben to protect Joseph so that he would not be killed. The Lord's hand was at work here to protect and preserve Joseph's life. Even in the midst of extreme difficulties, we can take comfort that the Lord is always at work. He will protect and preserve people as he sees fit to. Evil men, his brothers, wanted to destroy Joseph, but God would not allow that to happen. And God used Reuben's words to accomplish his perfect plan. Verse 23. So it came about, when Joseph reached his brothers, they stripped Joseph of his tunic, the varied colored tunic that was on him. And they took him and threw him into the pit. Now the pit was empty without any water in it. So get the picture here of what is being described. Joseph had been searching for days for his brothers, wandering throughout the land looking for them. As he approaches them, there was probably a little bit of relief in his mind. Over a week of searching, he finally found his brothers. Comes up to them, his brothers all gather around, but quickly Joseph finds out it's not a warm welcome from his brothers, it's an attack. And his brothers descend on him en masse, and they tear off his tunic. His beloved, vari-colored tunic, a symbol of his father's love, is ripped off of his back. He's brutally thrown down into an empty pit. And there he lay, likely bruised, perhaps bleeding. I doubt his brothers were real gentle as they did this to him. He's nearly naked, lying down in the rocky floor of an empty water cistern, likely an old well, a hole in the ground, from which there would be no escape by your own strength. It appears that his brother's intent was to leave him down in that pit, without water, without food, let him die of starvation or dehydration. Thus, technically, they would not have shed his blood. So in a twisted sense of morality, they could be innocent of killing their brother if they just left him down in that pit. But despite their evil actions, God was at work, even in the midst of their hateful acts. He was going to protect and preserve Joseph. He was going to actually remove Joseph from their reach. And so after throwing Joseph into a pit, we see how his brothers responded. Verse 25. Then they sat down to eat a meal. And as they raised their eyes and looked, behold, a caravan of Ishmaelites was coming from Gilead, and their camels bearing aromatic gum and balm and myrrh on their way to bring them down to Egypt. The coldness, the callousness of his brothers are revealed here. They just sit down to eat. They just beat their brother to a little pulp. They tossed him into a pit with the intent of letting him die there. And their response is not grief, not worry, not anything other than they kind of celebrate and sit down and have a meal. They are cold-hearted, filled with rage and hate, consumed in their hatred towards Joseph. So consumed by hatred towards God and his plan, they apparently feel no guilt at all in the way they're treating their brother. And as they sit down to eat, well, behold, by chance, a caravan of Ishmaelites, a group of merchants carrying spices and slaves to Egypt, just happened to pass by. Now we know once again this was not just chance at all. It was no coincidence that the brothers just happened to be in Dothan at this moment. It was a city which was on the main trade route from Damascus to Egypt. And it was no accident that that happened to be just where Joseph found them. And it was no accident that after they tossed Joseph in a pit and were celebrating with lunch, that a caravan just happened to come by their very location. God was at work. He wanted to move Joseph away from his hateful brothers, and he was at work, even in the midst of their sinful acts, to bring about his perfect plan. It's a reminder to us that God's sovereignty is always at work, even when men are hateful and violent. These brothers were thinking they were in control of their own destiny. They were acting purely out of their own selfish desires. And yet God was using all of that to bring about his perfect plan. And that's a great comfort to all of us. Even as men try to thwart God's plan, they can never do that. Evil men do violent acts, but even despite their acts of violence, God's plan will always be accomplished. A quick note about the wording in this passage. This group of traders is referred to as Ishmaelites, and then they're going to be referred to as Midianites. And some critics have used that to claim there's a discrepancy in the Bible. It talks about two different groups of people here, so there's a mistake. But there's no discrepancy, and this is no mistake. The caravan contained a mixture of Ishmaelites and Midianites. In fact, oftentimes those two terms were used interchangeably to describe this group of merchants. Both Ishmaelites and Midianites were descendants of Abraham, and they were nomadic merchants. Ishmaelite was a term often used to kind of describe the generic way of referring to all of these groups. Midianites were a specific tribe. So there's no discrepancy here. This is just describing those who made up the caravan. So let's see how the brothers respond to this so-called chance encounter with the caravan that was passing by. Verse 26. Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it for us to kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. He's our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers listened to him. Then some Midianites traders passed by, and so they pulled him up, lifted Joseph out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. And thus they brought Joseph into Egypt. Judah has a great idea. He says, you know what, there's no profit in killing our brother. If we leave him in the pit, we get nothing. But if we sell him to these slave traders, it's going to be a win-win for all of us. We don't have to kill him, and we get rid of him, and we make a few bucks. After all, he's our brother. Let's show him a little compassion. We can make a profit and not be murderers. And so they rationalize their activity. All the brothers agree, and so they sold their own flesh and blood into slavery for 20 shekels of silver. And the merchants took Joseph to Egypt as a slave. According to historians, 20 shekels of silver would have been the average price for a slave at this time. Typically, a shepherd would earn about 8 shekels in a year. So they made about 2.5 years' worth of salary by selling their own brother to these slave traders. A hefty profit to get rid of what they viewed as a problem in their life. Now they had Joseph not around. They had one less brother to split the inheritance when dad was gone. And so this was a win-win for them. Yet there's more than just simply seeking a money motivation here. Remember, these were sons of Jacob. They were sons of Israel. They knew the Lord had chose their father to inherit all the promises of Abraham. They knew that, and yet they took a son of Jacob, one of the line of Abraham, the man that the Lord had revealed to all of them through a dream that he would be the one to lead the family, and they took him and sold him into the hands of foreigners. They were sinning, not just against Joseph, not just against their father, but against the Lord. And they acted out of selfishness and hatred. And they thought truly they had thwarted God's plan. They believed wholeheartedly that as Joseph rode off in chains, they were finally rid of their brother. They thought they were successful in their sin. No one would ever know. They would never have to bow down to him. He was gone. He was never to be seen again. But God's plan cannot be thwarted by our sins. And God is always at work. And their act of sin done in secret would become a public event. Not only to their family, but to be recorded for all time in Scripture. There's an important message we learn throughout the Scripture. The sinful and hateful behavior of men can never stop God's perfect plan. And if you happen to be the victim of someone else's sin, it is so important to remember this truth. Because oftentimes innocent people suffer greatly at the hands of evil people. Joseph was innocent, and yet he suffered greatly at the hands of his brothers, and he's going to suffer even more at the hands of others as we continue on with his life. But that did not mean that God had abandoned him or had left him alone. This past week in Vegas, all those victims, they were not guilty of a crime deserving the death that they experienced. They suffered because of another sin. And when we see those things, when we experience those things in our own life, it is easy to wonder, is God really in control? Does God really care about what's going on in our lives? But we need to know that the promise of the Scripture is that despite the pain, despite the evil that men do, God is still in control. Part of allowing humanity to have free will is the reality that human beings choose to do evil all of the time. We often suffer because human beings have chosen to do evil. But no matter what we suffer, we can take comfort in knowing that God's ultimate plan will be accomplished. He is at work. He provides comfort to us in our times of pain. And He is present to move us forward according to His perfect plan. Don't forget, nothing can ever thwart God's plan. Nothing. Though evil was done to Joseph, God was still at work. Though evil was done in Vegas, God is still at work. Though evil is done over every part of our globe, even this morning, God is still at work. Evil events never mean that God is far away or that He doesn't care or that He has turned His back on us. It certainly didn't mean that for Joseph, and it doesn't mean it for us. He is ever near, working to bring good out of the pain and the heartache that we experience when human beings do sinful deeds to one another. Not even the most evil of deeds can stop God's purposes from being accomplished. See a third principle this morning. That is, God is at work even when all seems hopeless. Even when things are at their darkest. Even when things seem to be all lost. God is at work, and so we must never despair, but trust in His promises. Look at verse 29. Now Reuben returned to the pit, and behold, Joseph was not in the pit. So he tore his garments, and he returned to his brothers and said, "The boy is not there. As for me, where am I to go?" Apparently, Reuben was not there when they sold Joseph. He must have been off doing what they were supposed to be doing, caring for the flock. He was not with them as they made this decision. And when he returns, to his great surprise, his little brother is no longer in the pit, and he tore his clothes, an expression of his great grief, as they would do in this culture. Clearly, his grief was genuine. He didn't believe things could go so wrong. He fully expected to find Joseph in the pit, bruised maybe a little bit, but still alive, so that he could do what he wanted to do. But in his dismay, Reuben returns. It says, "The boy is not here. Where am I to go?" In other words, where shall I go to escape? Reuben's concern for his brother turns to fear for his own life. He realizes as the firstborn, he will have to give an account to his father for what just took place. And we see here the outcome of trying to manipulate others. The outcome of what happens when you try to play both sides. Reuben had played along with others in making them think that he was okay with their plan to harm Joseph. But his political wrangling, his acts of deception backfired, and now Joseph was gone. It is a warning to us that compromising with evil never works well in the end. So now he was forced to scramble to try to protect himself. Because now they were all in the boat together. They must work together to concoct a cover story to protect themselves. Clearly they didn't want to tell their dad, "Hey, we sold your favorite son into slavery." So they decide they're going to have to lie as a unit to save themselves. And they go back to their original thought. They would stage it, make it look like Joseph was killed by a beast. Their reasoning was they couldn't be held responsible if Joseph had been killed by a beast. After all, he was out wandering in the wilderness by himself. If they just weren't there, they're not going to be held guilty. Verse 31. So they took Joseph's tunic and slaughtered a male goat and dipped the tunic in their blood. And they sent the vari-colored tunic and brought it to their father and said, "We found this. Please examine it to see whether it is your son's tunic or not." They took his tunic, the one that would be no question it was Joseph's, the vari-colored tunic. And they dipped it in blood and they tore it up and they took that bloody tunic to their father. And they say, we found this tunic on our journey. Examine it. Could this be your son's? Once again, their callousness is clear even in the way they present this to their dad. They don't even speak their brother's name. They refer to him not as our brother, not as Joseph, but your son. They know clearly what Jacob's reaction would be to finding a bloody tunic, but they present it as if they have no clue what could have happened to Joseph. They play the role here of faithful sons who just happened to find this and are bringing it back for his inspection. Clearly, these brothers have no fear of the Lord, no concern at all for what was right. They began with hatred in their heart towards their brother, and that led to violence. They kidnapped their brother. They sold him into slavery. And now they fake their brother's death, and they deceive their own father and break his heart. And they do it all to cover up their own acts of sin. They do it all to try to make their lives a little easier. It's a reminder to us, when we choose to go down a path of sin, it will lead us further than we ever wanted to go. When we allow bitterness to remain in our heart and we don't deal with it, it will eventually consume us. And you will find yourself doing something that you never thought possible that you would do. When we allow hatred to grow in our hearts, we will eventually do unspeakable evil. That's what happened with his brothers. I doubt any of them years before thought that they would ever get to the point where they would actually try to murder their brother or sell him into slavery and then lie to their father to cover it up. But that's what hatred does to our hearts. And so we need to learn never to allow bitterness or hatred to take root and grow in our lives. It's also interesting to observe there is a bit of poetic justice here. That is, you might remember what Jacob did to his own dad. He had dressed in his brother's clothes with the skin and the meat of a goat. And he deceived his own father and lied to him and stole the blessing that was rightfully his older brother's. And now his own sons were deceiving him in much the same way, with clothing and with the blood of a goat. It's a reminder to us that we do reap what we sow. Jacob had practiced deception for many years, and he became the recipient of others' deception many times. The brothers would also one day have to face the consequences of their sins. What we reap, we will sow. Jacob looks at his bloody, vari-colored tunic, and the conclusion is obvious. Verse 33. He examined it and said, "It's my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn into pieces." And so Jacob tore his clothes and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days. Verse 35. Then all his sons and all his daughters arose to comfort him. But he refused to be comforted. He said, "Surely I will go down to Sheol in my mourning for my son." So his father wept for him. Jacob assumes the evidence that he sees before his eyes means that his beloved son has been killed by wild beasts. And so he goes into a severe depression. His son was dead. I'm sure he blamed himself in part. He is the one who sent Joseph out all by himself on this journey. And clearly the fact that he was by himself led to these wild beasts getting him. Now he was dead and his heart was broken. And we're told Jacob could not be consoled. His grief was overwhelming. And again, we see the callousness, the hypocrisy of his other sons. They tried to comfort him. All the while, they knew they were the cause of their father's despair. All the while, if they would have just confessed and came clean, it certainly would have eased Jacob's mind. But they remained silent, even as they watched their father in agony. Jacob declares, "I will go to my grave mourning for my son." In other words, his pain was so severe, he had lost his son, he would grieve the remainder of his days. But the reality was, Joseph wasn't dead at all. Verse 36, meanwhile, the Midianites sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, Pharaoh's officer, the captain of the bodyguard. While Jacob was weeping in despair over the death of his son, Joseph was alive. He was a slave in Egypt, in the house of Potiphar. We see God was at work in the midst of this horrible situation, and he had a plan. And the remainder of the account will tell us what happens to Joseph in Egypt. But remember all the dreams that Joseph had and he had shared with his family, that the brothers would bow down and one day his mother and father would bow down. His father heard the dreams. He knew the prophecy that one day he himself would bow before Joseph. And Jacob knew that God always keeps his promises. He knew that God's prophecies would come true. Jacob had received dreams himself. He had been one who spoke to God himself. He knew by firsthand experience God always does what he says. And God had promised one day all of them would bow before Joseph. So perhaps if Jacob had remembered God's promise, if he had believed God's revelations to Joseph in his dream, maybe he just wouldn't have jumped to the conclusion that Joseph was dead. After all, there was no body, there was no evidence other than a bloodied tunic. He could have escaped, he could have been free, he could have been roaming the hills somewhere looking for a way to get home. Joseph's sorrow may not have been so great if he had stopped and remembered God's promise. If he had held out hope that despite the evidence in his hands, Joseph was still alive. Because God had promised specifically Joseph was going to be the leader. So he had to be alive because God always keeps his word. But clearly Jacob forgot the dreams. He focused on his fear and his pain. He either forgot them or he didn't believe that God would really do as he had promised. But God was at work. And even though all seemed hopeless on the surface, God would accomplish his promise just as he said he would. Even when we don't know how. Even when we don't see how it's possible for God to bring good out of a horrible situation, we've got to trust his promises that he will do as he has said. Oftentimes we bring extra pain into our lives just because we don't trust that God will do as he says. But even when all is hopeless on the surface, even when it is the darkest of nights, God is still at work. And our lives as believers would go so much smoother if we would just trust him. Certainly, Jacob could have saved many tears and many sleepless nights if he would have reminded himself of God's promises and trusted them. If he would have remembered God's promise, then he would have had comfort and peace. In the midst of uncertainty of where Joseph was, he would have known, hey, God promised a future for Joseph, so I don't know where he is, but he's got to be alive because God always does what he promises. But when we don't believe God's promise, we bring more pain into our own lives. When we focus on our circumstance, when we lose sight of who God is and what He has said to us, when we say all hope is gone, God has left me, God has abandoned me, then we bring so much self-inflicted pain and agony into our lives. And we need to remember, we can trust God's promise. He is ever near to us. And in times of great strain and sorrow, we need to take our pain to the Lord in prayer. We need to trust that He is at work and He has a plan and He will accomplish it. And trusting in Him is what brings comfort even in the midst of our heartache. God has promised us in His Word that one day justice will be carried out. One day sin will be no more. And so when we see horrible events, we take hope that that day is nearer now than it ever was. That one day sin will be no more. When we see a lack of justice taking place in our world, we have hope that one day God will bring justice because He's promised to do so. Evil men will pay for their evil deeds. And in times of pain and sorrow, we need to remember that God has promised that He is ever near us. Deuteronomy 31:6, we read this, "Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or tremble at them. For the Lord your God is the one who goes with you. He will not fail you or forsake you." God has promised He will not fail us. He will never forsake us. This is a promise repeated throughout the Old and the New Testament. As believers, we have God's promise. He will never leave us nor forsake us. He has a purpose and a plan. And somehow He has promised that He will bring good even out of men's most horrific acts of evil. Knowing that, believing that to be true, is what brings us peace in times of turmoil. Knowing that God was in control is what will enable Joseph to respond the way we see him respond in his life. Even as his brothers betrayed him, even as he was sold into slavery, even as more unspeakable acts of horror take place in Joseph's life, he trusted that God would do as He promised, and that enabled him to continue to serve God in faithfulness. Now, God's promise of protection and His presence, it's only made to those who are believers. And if you are here and you have never placed your faith in Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, then the reality is you don't have the promise of God's presence being near because He is not near your life, not yet. But you can change that by putting your faith in Him. And if you'd like to speak to somebody about how you can have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, please see me after the service. The reality is God is at work in our world. He's at work in the humdrum events of everyday life. He's at work even when men act hatefully. He is at work even when all seems hopeless. God is at work, and we never need doubt that reality. Remember that as you seek to live for Him in the week ahead. The Lord is in control. He has a plan, and even though it may seem as if He has abandoned you, that is not the reality. He is near you as much as He was near Joseph as he lay in that pit. And as we believe these truths, we can have peace, especially in uncertain times. Let's pray.